Okay, everybody, thanks for coming back to the Xanadu Review. My name is Prester John Anders, but as always, you can just call me PJ. Well, today with me, I have it's a little bit of a treat for me. One of my first, I guess you could say, Substack friends when I first started joined this website. We have with me today Peewee Hermeneutics, who, truth be told, I originally just followed you because like I thought your name was funny, and I thought, yeah, I'll give this guy a follow. But you've proved to be like an interesting writer and an interesting guy. So, Peewee, I'd like to, thank you for coming on. And if you want to just tell the audience a little bit about yourself, like what kind of writing you do, your beat, so to speak.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me on. And likewise, as in Spanish they say igualmente in terms of back to you, equally back to you, on all accounts. But yeah, so I've been a writer for a little bit. I've been on Substack for about 4 years, but didn't really know what I was doing. Didn't really know what I would like to be doing. I feel like that only recently kind of revealed itself the past couple of years. I'm originally from Texas, but I moved out to California, and I've been writing since I was 12. That's something that my first love was kind of poetry. I know we're gonna kind of maybe touch on that a little bit here. But on Substack, with my page in particular, I feel as if I just kind of try and write whatever I'm feeling and write. And honestly, I've been inspired by seeing a lot of people are doing on the medium. I've made kind of forays into autofiction and poetry and like cultural critique and critical theory and things of that nature. And I'm just still kind of developing it. And but fiction as well. That's something that I've kind of delved into a little bit. And like I guess my beat, that'd be a tough question. It seems all over the place, but I also, my day job is in the cannabis industry, so I kind of have now formulated some opinions on that as well, which I kind of try and reflect in the writing. But yeah, that would generally be it. It'd be awesome if one day this could turn into something where I get to do the writing full time, but maybe Substack can hopefully be a part of that. But we shall see.
Well, fingers crossed, right? Because I think you probably have a better chance than many. Because I don't know. I guess my wife works in marketing, so maybe she knows this type of thing. But at least for me, like I feel like people who have because there's some people who write on Substack who I enjoy, or just in general as writers who like. You kind of don't need to check in with everything they do because they will, it's usually variations on a theme, right? So it's like, all right, I know what your opinion is going to be, or like you're covering the same types of subjects where you're one of those writers like, okay, well what's Peewee dropping this week? Or, it's a little bit different every time. And that's kind of what I like about you. And, I don't want to do that. I think we're kind of past that phase of being like very, the kids say these days, glazing Substack as a medium. But I think that's kind of the cool thing about the medium, that like you can kind of have your own proprietary blend of whatever your thing is, and you can just kind of find your audience and go for it.
I agree, and I feel as if it's one of those things where I feel a lot more freedom to do those kinds of things on the medium for sure. But it's tough to really break into what you want to be doing in a more traditional way. It feels just because it feels like there's like you said, there's a preference for narrowness and predictability that I kind of don't. I try and cut against, I suppose. And I guess on this topic, with your kind of evolution on Substack as well, I know you got, it seems to me like a really great, like job in the tech sector, and have like kind of been in that for a bit now. But would you feel as if Substack or writing full time is something that you desire as well?
Well, that's a good question. Like, because I don't know, like I started writing essentially as I joined Substack, because I had a friend who he was like, you have some interesting things to say. You should just try to start writing, and some people started to listen. And I kind of had the podcast was the same thing. Where like I just I just want to have some conversations with people. People like you who are like I like what you do, and it'd be cool to have a conversation. And I have a little bit of an audience, but like the mechanics of like where I'm at right now to what would be not even like a full-time job, but to like have it be worth my time to really try to strongly monetize it. It feels like it's a difficult slope. And I think you kind
Yeah.
of have, I don't know, I think you have to get lucky or, I don't want to like downplay the talent, hard work people do into it. Like they get lucky, put a lot of hard work or find your niche. And I kind of like you do. And that's what I feel like, there are ways that we intersect with our politics and our worldview, but there are ways that we're different. But I really identify with a lot of what you do because, like I said, it's eclectic. And that's kind of how at least I like to think of myself as it's eclectic of like, I'll do political stuff or stuff about tech, or I guess you could even say spirituality. And I think that's not really like necessarily the most marketable thing. I think if you're trying to find your niche and your personality, and extrapolate that out into a body of work, you kind of just really have to get lucky from there.
Yeah, or you just can create a huge audience based on the fact that you're reassuring them that all their prejudices and ways of living are correct.
Which
Or,
I can't stand doing. Like
yeah,
it's probably hurt me because like I'm somebody who like I have people in my audience who are like left leaning or right leaning, and like I feel like I will consciously or subconsciously, like if I feel like the audience is zigging one way, I'll zag the other, or just because like I can't stand that like let me just play to an audience. Let me say, I could yap for, it's like, oh, being mad at trans people or being mad at MAGA. Like, it's just like so one note that like, at that point you might as well just have AI do it.
absolutely, absolutely. And so, when it comes to like writing itself, and like I know we kind of discussed maybe talking about literature here. Um, what do you feel? Do you feel as if the way these kinds of this push towards a quote unquote decentralized platform such as Substack, how does that impact how you view literature? Or if you wanted to scrap what I'm just saying and kind of broach it differently, of like, I guess we could do the Jordan Peterson thing of like, well, define literature.
Well, it depends what you mean by, but go ahead. Yeah, no, is that the full question? I know I always want this to be kind of Socratic and, say what you will about him, but like I'm kind of shooting for the Joe Rogan model here of like, I just have people on who I find interesting. There's not a universal theme necessarily, and let's just see where the conversation goes. So yeah, if that's the question, like, I guess it's made me rethink literature and like the written word, because at least to me, and bear in mind I border on a high school dropout, so I don't know if I'm necessarily using the right word. Like literature to me is like serious fiction books or something like that, or like what like nonfiction type of stuff. It's a little bit different, but to me, like literature was something that um, it was either like I would read like very serious books about like I sometimes joke that like the types of books I read are like some book about like how the Mongol Empire and its late age, how their economic policies had downstream effects in like the Soviet Union, and their policies in Afghanistan, or like it's the Dark King's Sword Dragon Part 12. Like those are the two types of things that I wrote that was like very bifurcated between what I saw as very serious, like intellectual pursuits or politics stuff, or just like pure fun entertainment. Whereas actually writing has kind of made me rethink, like the way people consume media, because when you're writing, as you know, as a writer, like especially in like a medium like Substack where you get instant feedback, and you're like riding the dragon of the current thingism, which I generally try to
Yeah.
avoid, but you can't avoid 100%. It definitely has made me like rethink and recontextualize it, where like it's almost impossible not to be a reactionary of one stripe or another, unless you just like never look at the timeline. You just go out to a cabin in the woods, write it, post it, go back to the cabin in the woods.
Right. Yes. Correct. And I think that's very astute. I think when I went to college, I studied creative writing, and so there was some conversations along these lines. And I've always felt that the whole definition of what literature is has been something that I've been thinking about for these past 10 years. So I was excited by the idea that you approached me with about talking about it. But ironically enough, one of the first classes that I had, which was like a freshman elective class, was called "What Does Literature Do?" And we were kind of trying to parse out, as well as a bunch of 19 to 20-year-olds in Orange County, California, could, what is the definition of literature versus a story? And as you mentioned, is entertainment a component of that, or is it something that some may argue would be contrary to like the nature of literature? And then I guess also when you have something as if we think of literature as a canon of physical text that kind of some people feel as if it's strictly in the past, and that it admittance into this canon of literature in the digital age is complicated by how is it possible, because of the decentralization, like you said, where you are interacting with this current thing, and is it the digital media make it everything ephemera? Does it make it everything transient to the point where that lasting impact we might have discussed in that freshman class I had about literature, is that even possible in this day and age? It's something that I've been, thinking about a lot. I guess in my mind, or actually in your mind, what do you think would be to you something that's a book, or that you think is like literature with a capital L?
Are we talking fiction or nonfiction?
Well, I guess that's either or, whatever pops into your head first.
Um, it's a difficult question because again, like I read a lot of different books that are like historical tomes, because I'm a big history guy. So, like for example, I just finished reading a book called "The People's Tragedy" by like Paul Feig, something Feigs, and it's a really, really long and interesting book on like like the time leading up to the Russian Revolution, and like going through the Red Terror and the Russian Civil War, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I was like, okay, well, this isn't literature. This is, or at least that's what I would have thought until fairly recently. It's not really literature. It's like reciting knowledge essentially. But especially like, as me, somebody, and you, me knowing your political background, if looking at like the concept of historical materialism, like you can't really, it's basic. You can technically just recite the facts, but it's basically impossible to divorce those facts from context, historically and culturally, as well as like the worldview of the author, as well as the person who's reading it. So I think to be mindful of that, I think that it deliver back to it. Other than that, like as far as like nonfiction or sorry fiction goes, I guess I'm kind of basic because like it's maybe incredibly basic, but like The Hobbit is probably my favorite book that's like a fiction book, just because It's something I read when I was a kid, and I can pretty much always go back to it and um, enjoy it. Like, I can enjoy it as a child and enjoy it as an adult. I was recently on a podcast by a guy on Substack named Theon Ultima, and his podcast was called In Kino Veritas, where I kind of talked about the same thing with the Conan the Barbarian movie, where
Hmm.
excuse me. So like when I was a kid, I really liked it was a Arnold with a big sword, and as I kind of like was dismissive of it as like say what you will, toxic masculinity or over the top 80s cheese. But as I got older again, like I realized um the effort that went into like A, the filmmaking, but B, the kind of perennial storytelling that goes into a story like Conan the Barbarian, because I would later read Robert E. Howard. So I excuse me. I don't know. I feel like I'm maybe not the right person to ask about that. Just because to me, like it's kind of a I don't really know how to define literature. So I guess how do you? I mean, again, like we're sounding like Jordan Peterson here, but how do you define literature, Peewee?
I would, for me, as I think it's a fluid definition to me. The one of the key things I would use as an analysis for myself of when I read or consume something as what I call the 2 week test, which is that, you could watch something on Netflix and theoretically be entertained by it, or you could read a book that they call a quote unquote beach read and theoretically be entertained by it. But then, within maybe at the very least 72 hours, it could have completely slipped through your fingers. And I think the 2 week test to me is, if in 2 weeks' time, is there some sort of subtext or reason for me to reconsider what I have consumed? And then if it does, then it carries a certain weight that you can start to sift through everything. And then the gold flakes start to appear. And to me, if it would be kind of like a kind of audience and source material relationship where beyond that 2 weeks, maybe even years, you find yourself returning to an aspect of something that has kind of altered your perspective or given you better insight into values you already held, or maybe challenged them. But essentially, just you know, I would consider the idea of literature as something that um, it's like a dunk of your face into ice cold water, and it kind of has a sort of change to your kind of physiology in that moment, and shocks you or makes you think. And that's kind of, I think, what I would define like something that I would call literature versus entertainment or a story.
Mhm.
And I actually think what you were saying about, fiction or nonfiction, some of the literature that I've consumed that I would say, has impacted me most significantly is the like books that have an intertextuality between fiction and nonfiction. In that, for example, that book I was telling you about, In Cold Blood by Truman Capote, is a retelling of murders that happened in the 50s that actually happened, but and involving real people, and using the same names of the people who existed in real life, but of course giving insight into thoughts and emotions, and kind of, I'm sure, fictionalizing certain elements so that it creates a cohesive narrative structure, and sort of through a lie arrives at a deeper truth where you can, beyond just a historical reproduction of like, this is how the murders happened and the blood spatter looked like this and the shotgun looked like this.
Mm-hmm.
It's you get kind of he very seamlessly connects it to like kind of like the larger American experience, and especially at that time, Truman Capote, like famous like gay man at a time when very not cool to be gay. It was not cool to be gay in the 50s, as shocking as it may
Hmm.
be to say. Uh, but I think that is how I would kind of approach a personal definition of literature. It's just something that kind of provides insight, uh, and maybe even has like a lasting impact, like The Hobbit to you. Although it is fiction, it has a very non-fiction impact on values, and I'm sure that had an impact on your view of what heroism was, or what bravery meant, and what friendship meant, and like all those kinds of things. So I guess that's how I would define it. And I guess I would expand that to, perhaps other mediums of like storytelling beyond just books could be literature, as long as it had that emotional resonance.
Hmm. Well, I think that's a really good way of putting it because it kind of makes me think of, I mean, at least for me personally, like I don't, I think I've read a little bit what you have read about this, and I'll let you speak to your own experience. But at least for me, like I grew up in like a very religious environment, um, and probably up until like 12 or 13, I was very, very Christian. Like my dad was a pastor. I come from like a long line of very religious, and like my great grandfather was a pastor. Um, but I kind of went through that edgy atheist phase pretty early on, and I feel to a certain degree the not exclusively but works like the works of Tolkien kind of took same that same place in my life and my morality with the significance it had of like standing up to evil no matter what, even if you're small and you don't think you can do something important. That's something that really resonated with me. And it kind of makes me think about like my mother is still very religious. um and talked to her about it a couple I think it was in the last year or so. And she said something to the effect of kind of like what you and I have been saying, is like you can read a Bible story and when you're just a child, like it's very surface level. Like the example that I often give with something like this is uh like the book of Job. Like when I was a kid, I just took it at very surface level, of like oh well, it's about trusting God or whatever. And when I was in my
Mm-hmm.
edgy teenager atheist phase, I was like, it's probably like the Bible story that made me the most angry of like, well, God is just torturing this guy to win a bet essentially. um and then I got, even only in the last couple of years, I re-examined it, ironically from a secular perspective, because I was reading a book called Dominion by Tom Holland, where he talks about like a secular history of Christianity, like a material analysis of the Bible and the history of Christianity, and recontextualizing the story of Job. It was like originally like a Babylonian story or something that like ancient Hebrews took and recontextualized. And um, I guess it's kind of a long-winded way of saying like re-understanding and reinterpreting the story is like it's not meant to be taken literally. I guess if you're Orthodox Christian or evangelical, whatever. But like the Jews, or I think even a lot of Catholics, don't take this story literally. Like the story is about, you don't do the right thing because it's the right, you think you're going to get rewarded. You do the right thing because it's the right thing. So I guess that's kind of a long-winded way of saying like, I feel like that is the value that literature had. And I don't say this like punitively towards religion, or literature either, because um I try to be more open-minded about these things these days. But I feel like religion had um a point like this, it had a role in people's life of like this universally agreed upon thing. Like these are these cultural touchstones that everybody knows the Bible, and it can be reinterpreted or reimagined in different ways. And I think that's kind of the value of literature now, is it's has these archetypical stories that everybody can relate to, but can also be more inclusive.
I like it, and I see kind of, so there's perhaps what I think I hear in what you're suggesting is that there's an element of connection, reconstitution, and kind of reinterpretation that takes place over time that can kind of make literature. And of course, like I would certainly call the Bible literature as well. And I would wholly like agree with what you're saying. Play on words, boom. But
it's like you're a writer.
But yeah, guilty. But I was also going to say that I really resonated as well with the whole. I similarly had an atheist phase as well. My religious environment was a little bit different in that my parents were kind of sort of agnostic. I was growing up, mom was Catholic, sort of had kind of a feminist reaction to being in a Catholic environment, and kind of tried to define herself as like a career woman at a time when that was very difficult. And my dad was just sort of muted on the topic, despite that fact, because I was, growing up in Texas. If you really want to give your kid as good of a fighting chance to get into a good college as you can, many of the private schools are solely religiously affiliated. So I was kind of raised in an Episcopalian environment for most of my life. And I, for the most part, besides in attendance towards a Bible camp where I kind of had my own sort of overzealous conversion story, but that's a whole can of worms for a different time. I had kind of a respect for the teachings that were given that were just kind of just general morality plays, rather than hemming and hawing about, if you don't accept Jesus in your heart, you're going to hell. And, here's the culture war framed through a Christian lens. It was just kind of more
Satanism.
about behavior. Yeah, exactly. It was
Sorry
just more about,
but yes.
No, but yeah, so like it was just more so about, general how to be a good person, how to embody kindness, what the lessons of Jesus' ministry actually meant. And and I, when I was a teenager, had that sort of atheist reaction to my environment at that time. But then down the line, when I got to college, I haven't read the book, but a movie that was based on the book, The Last Temptation of Christ, kind of had me return to an interest minor in religion, because I felt it. Have you seen that movie, by the way?
No, it's Willem Dafoe, right?
Yes, he is. He plays.
I know
JC.
of it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's so good. And
from the same small Wisconsin where I'm from, funnily enough.
Oh, really? Oh, legend.
Yeah, my wife's dad, like he is the pastor at the church that Willem Dafoe went to. Not at the same time, but my wife's dad, technically, I guess father-in-law, has Willem Dafoe's childhood number from the 70s. So that's my small claim to fame. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
Wow, it's all overlapping. So there's
I'm a nepo baby. I'm sorry.
A beneficiary of the Dafoe name. Mm-hmm. But so anyway, the movie has, to me, the synthesis of the three gospel stories that I think is so amazing and affecting, wherein one of the biggest differences between the gospel stories of Jesus' ministry is what the final words that he shares on the cross. And I'm a bad pseudo-academic Christian in that I don't recall which gospel, which saying is attributed to. However, one of the sayings is, something very self-determined, where he says, "It is accomplished." Then another one of the sayings is, "Forgive them, Father, they know not what they do." And then a third one is, "Oh, Father, why have you forsaken me?" And that's kind of one of the big differentiating points between these gospels, of basically the same story of Jesus' ministry with some key details shifted around. But in this novelization of it, where Jesus very controversially has an encounter with Satan, played by Harvey Keitel, where basically he gets to see what his mortal life would be like if he was with Mary Magdalene. And so then the movie reframes it as like those three lines as like an evolution in his character arc where he eventually ends up at it is accomplished. But at first he's kind of scared and he says, why have you done this to me? And I found it so beautiful and affecting and kind of recontextualized my experience with the Christian faith in a manner that I really kind of made me want to re-examine the Abrahamic religions and made me want to take classes in Islam and Hebrew mythology and Christianity. And I think that would be kind of like even though it was a movie based on the novelization, that to me is like a great example for my own personal story of like what literature can do. Is that I'd been raised in this Christian environment for, up through like 19 years pretty much. And then I saw this movie and it completely I was like, dang, do I even really understand my own life? And then it kind of has this thing where these new opportunities and perspectives kind of grow from a resonant story. So all this to say, watch that movie. It's great. I think, as someone who has also grown up in a Christian environment, I think I'd be curious to hear your thoughts for sure.
Well, I will put that on my list, and I'll DM you with my thoughts because I think that's it's a very interesting way of putting it because it's So I mentioned the book Dominion by Tom Holland, and it's something that's been pretty popular in the last couple of years, and I think a lot of people have rediscovered Christianity through it. And I'm not quite there myself. I guess I would call myself agnostic. But the thing that I found both interesting about that and your story is like, you say it is a fictionalized version of a Bible story, but that's kind of like a lot of what the Catholic Church did was adding and like integrating into the biblical text the experiences of like recent converts or pagans. Like one of my favorite anecdotes is in the conquest / conversion of the South Americans, when the Spanish went over to South America, like Christianity didn't stick until they really strongly emphasized the Virgin Mary, because in the South American indigenous cultures, like the sacred feminine was a very important aspect of their spiritual life and their self-conception. And once they were able to introduce the sacred feminine essentially through the Virgin Mary, then it was able to take off. And that's basically the only place in the world where Christianity is growing, even still to this day. Which is all that to say, I feel like, be it with religion or literature, and I feel like that to me, it is a part of, and maybe I'm going a little left of field here, and I apologize for that, but to me, what has changed my mind on being a hardcore atheist is believing there is something about human consciousness that is more than just the material, because I was very much atheist, Marxist, just the material, but I had a couple experiences that kind of dissuaded me from that purely material analysis. One of which, I feel like I almost had a heart attack, and an article that I remember you shared back in the day, which thank you, by the way, since that was I feel like you're one of the first bigger accounts who shared something that I wrote on the masculine urge to die in a suicidal cavalry charge. I was just working myself to death and I had to go to the emergency room essentially. But all that to say that I feel everybody needs to find their own version of a spirituality, which can come through something non-material, I guess, that should come through spirituality or religion or literature, what have you, because I feel like that's kind of what makes life worth living more than just the material. Because I brought up the book Dominion just because, at least for me, as somebody who's probably more I guess left brain at times, is and somebody who's a history nerd, reading about the actual events that were happening for the ancient Hebrews or the ancient Greeks, everything that was happening at the time, And it was like, the way that I see it is like, okay, these things are not literally true, but they have like an emotional resonance that were like how people made sense of their suffering and made it like, have meaning. Um, which I think, be it religion or even modern literature, I think that's kind of the value and like universal humanity that shines through, if that makes sense.
100%. And I think again, it complicates because it shows the kind of tenuous separation between, reality and fiction. It's like, if it can have a real impact, does that mean it's fictional? And,
Mm-hmm.
and there an account, and if it is a metaphorical story that has led to the engine of thousands of years of historical events, does that mean it can be thought of as strictly mythology?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I find those are, these kinds of questions too are kind of like that, at least to my understanding of what postmodernism is, and like the sort of idea of like what people view as the erosion of objective truth, to me is kind of an embrace of a plurality of perspectives and understanding of reality as perception, and how perception is just as equally determined by metaphor as it is, and I'm doing air quotes right now, objectivity. And what I think you said reminds me of this story. I'm again kind of going on the literature as religion tip. I had this great professor who was a Catholic priest, and he actually would get into hot water because he would go and give these sermons where, he would talk about passages from the Bible, and he'd preface it by saying, this didn't actually happen this way, that, and
Mm-hmm.
he would preface it that way, but say that that doesn't mean that it's not incredibly significant, that God doesn't want us to know this story, doesn't want us to know the truth behind this narrative. But he always said that that would make, people get up and leave, because I think for a great many people, especially for something as life orienting as religion, that kind of fluidity of truth and meaning, or it's like, does meaning have to be something that I hold, versus can I like let myself submit to things beyond my understanding, and that this is just a glimpse into it. It's like profoundly uncomfortable for most people. And I think that that's actually why, like the state of modern literature is in the way that it is, because I feel people don't want to try and authentically encounter the nature of their beliefs, be it spiritual, political, or otherwise, and
Yeah.
I think people might be seeking out, sort of, like we said, like that reassurance of a sort of, a lot of people, and there's a great many exceptions, and like I think hopefully there'll be a vibe shift of people kind of being wanting to kind of have those conversations more and test those things. But I think that
Mm-hmm.
that's, like an element of this that certainly I think about on the regular.
Yeah. No, and that makes a lot of sense. And that kind of loops back to one of the original things that I wanted to talk to you about. And something I kind of want to talk to you about a little bit later in the conversation as well. Because, like, on one level, I get it. Like, for somebody like me, or it sounds like you, who was raised in a religious environment, like, and wanting to have freedom and recontextualization, that deconstruction can be something that's very comforting and like allow you to appreciate it in a whole new way. But for some people, and I think especially, you talk about the vibe shift, like, um, things are getting materially a lot more difficult. And at those times, people don't necessarily want that deconstruction. They want something that's comforting and constant. Like I remember reading recently, like, the branches of Christianity that are dying are essentially like, the more open to interpretation, liberal ones, whereas like the more conservative branches of Christianity, like Catholicism or like Orthodox Christianity are growing. And you could say maybe that's like, if you're being flippant, that's a recession indicator. But at the same time, like it feels like there's a constant dialectic there between wanting to have some kind of certainty, and wanting to have some wiggle room to kind of figure it out yourself. And that's something I kind of always struggled with in religion. But I'm curious to your thoughts on, and we touched on this earlier, like how does this play out as far as literature goes? Because just my personal story with this is, um, I posted like a handful of poems that I've done. Um, and I originally did it because like I had a friend, shout out to my friend on here, Chesterton's Fence, who's kind of like my writing mentor and friend. He's like, this poem's good. You should post it. And I did a few more. I was like, I like your poetry. It reminds me of Charles Bukowski. So he bought me a Charles Bukowski book. And then I made the mistake of like going online and checking on like Substack and Reddit. And it was like, oh, well, Charles Bukowski is this white male writer who did talks about, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, well, what's wrong with being a white male writer? Blah, blah, this is why men don't read anymore. And it's like, wow, if this had been my first introduction to this writer in this subject, I would be like, well, I don't want to engage with this anymore. This is terrible. And I feel like that kind of speaks to the fact that, like, at least to me, and I'm curious to your perspective, because we've been kind of since that post World War II period, the 60s and 70s, really up until like the past maybe 20 years or so, where there's been kind of a more reactionary pushback. We were in that deconstruction phase, but be it the quote unquote woke side who wants to deconstruct that, or the reactionary side, quote unquote, who wants to hold that up. I feel like we're kind of at a place in culture right now where people want something that is more, you can sink your teeth into a little bit more and hold on to more. And I'm not sure what that's going to look like, but it does feel like that's kind of the direction that people are moving towards, that like there's a limit to deconstruction, where then there's no more solid ground to stand upon. And I guess I'm curious to like what your perspective on that is in regards to like literature, like, the quote unquote Western canon, what have you, or like culture more broadly, because this is something I struggle with and think about a lot of, like, you can either be like a micro celebrity but there is something to the deconstruction of these canons and everything. And I'm sympathetic to many of these arguments, but I think there's also a value to having something that, is a baseline that you're working from, that you deconstruct, as opposed to just having like this constant nebulous all against all, if that makes sense.
I think it does. And I think it reminds me of that post that you made where you were making the argument for basically like, we need more heroes because this is kind of the time of this is kind of a fallen time. And you felt as if we needed kind of more people who were, or like stories where people were kind of holding a torch to rally people behind more kind of clear, you do this is what we do, this is the right thing. And kind of, I saw it as like a sort of a delightful polemic against the anti-hero. Is that kind of a fair, like,
yeah,
sort
that's
of, like that is there? I would say.
No, you're right. It was on the Venture Bros, and like I don't know if you ever watched that, but it was very much like, it started out as kind of like taking the piss out of the heroes, but at least to me, as you said in the piece, it was about like, existing in a fallen world and still trying to do the right thing and have morals, regardless of the fact that it's not necessarily going to be, that Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. And to me, that is something that is the heroism that our era needs, is, being morally consistent, if like, pragmatic on the specifics.
I get that. I guess for me, I think it's something that I'm frustrated by, but also interested in. I have a love-hate relationship with sort of the anti-hero equation, something that I personally struggle with. I'll give you a couple of examples. I was watching The Sopranos when I was depressed and unemployed, and it was
Good
making me
move.
feel worse. It was making me feel worse, but I also
Hmm.
couldn't stop watching it. And
I did
despite
the
the
same
fact
thing
that,
recently, funnily enough.
yeah,
It's not a good.
yeah,
It's not a
exactly,
good depress. I would like to say on the Xanadu review, and I'll speak on behalf of Peewee. If you're unemployed and depressed, don't watch The Sopranos. It's not a good move.
exactly. Yeah, we can wholeheartedly agree on that. Um, and I would say, and I felt, you know, there is, it's something that's kind of written previous subs. Uh, I the deconstruction that I would, I guess, be interested in place is uh, it's a high wire act, because I feel as if, in contrast to The Sopranos, which by the end sort of basically shows that all these characters are in hell, and that they're going to hell, and that there's one place they're going, and it's hell.
Hmm.
Uh, you have, on the other side of that coin, to me, is a show like Dexter, which I think really gets off on the idea that it's like, you want to be doing this too, man. You want to
I
be,
couldn't.
you
That's kind of what
know
I
what I
got.
mean?
Yeah, I started watching that show like when I first started dating my wife. And as I feel like pretty much anybody, regardless of your gender, when you first start dating somebody you really like, you'll watch a show you don't really like, because you like that person. But that was one I couldn't get through. It was just like so very like, I don't know, pornographic is maybe the right word. It was like, I'm an edgy psychopath. I can't get along with normal people because I'm a psychopath. Did I mention I'm a psychopath? I do the most violent, heinous things, but it's okay because these people are actually worse than me. I just couldn't
Exactly.
get into that one. And kind of the same way that like Breaking Bad kind of lost me after a while, or I mean, also like a lot of the comedy now, like I could never. I feel like it's not like a controversial thing to shit on Rick and Morty these days. But I hated Rick and Morty before it was popular. Like it has its moments. I have people. My wife really likes it, and friends who really like it. But to me, like that, the trope of like, let's just arbitrarily be mean to and shit on one character. Like they're really mean to Jerry, or like in Family Guy they're really mean to Meg, or Breaking Bad, like Walter is a piece of shit. And I don't think like you need to have these like childish morality plays. Um, and it's okay to tell a complicated story with an unlikable character, but I guess that's kind of what I was getting at. If you don't have a central
A
understood
soul.
morality, yeah, soul, a central understood morality that is being deconstructed, like it just kind of ends up meaning nothing, and it's just kind of nihilistic. And and again, like maybe you can relate. When I was a young man, a teenager, a young man in my atheist phase, very materialistic, pretty much only cared about a couple of things, um, you know, trying to be successful, sex, drugs, etc. That was great. But it's something that's just, as you said, it's totally lacking in a soul, and it is so destructive to the individual, and I think the society that the individual exists in. And it's a very fine line between like that puritanical destructive moralizing and like the moralizing of like, it's not good for you as an individual, and it's not good for the society that you exist in.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, to use your Family Guy metaphor, like kind of to connect to that, I feel as if the characteristic difference between something like Family Guy and The Simpsons is that whole idea of a soul. Is that there is this sweetness to the Simpsons. There is a sense of like, yeah, certainly it is a deconstruction, as you said, of like, very pointed, the nuclear American family. It's an investigation of like, people, like the antipathy siblings have, and absentee fathers who put all the child rearing on the mother, and yet it still invites you to see yourselves in these people, and has a great amount of empathy for people who are trying to make it in a very imperfect way. And
Hmm.
whereas on the other hand, uh, a show like Family Guy is just punching downwards, kind of like grotesque, uh, like
Hmm.
indulgent, pop cultural. Uh, I mean, I guess,
Libidinous, cruelty.
yeah, exactly. And I feel like that, to me, for example, there has to be a kind of, if not uh, a soul itself, a kind of biting commentary on the absence of the soul, which I feel something like American Psycho would be, or, and even in this book, In Cold Blood, which is one of my most recent reads that I felt as if I'm comfortable saying is definitely literature. Um, it in these killers, it shows that they're a byproduct of their environment, and it dares in a very compelling way to show that, you know, they had slipped through the cracks. Nobody was paying attention to people who were, one of whom was, very physically stunted. So kind of like, I think he was like, he had very long arms and very short legs and was kind of treated by a very eugenics focused 1950s society as like, an untouchable basically. And it's not to say that this gives them a pass or this makes us feel like we should like them, but just invites us to kind of deconstruct, like, how is the absence of the soul something that is endemic upon birth, or is it something that is created by societal conditions where everybody who remarks on the murders that they perpetrate insert themselves into it? It's very narcissistic. It's very, everybody's getting lost, talking past each other. That is where I think I kind of lie on the deconstructive versus sort of, clear uh, moral standards in storytelling and literature more broadly, is that I want there to be a soul, or I want there to be a kind of a commentary on what that coldness means. And I feel like I come away from it with an understanding, like, of that person's station in this world, and how they were shaped by it, and how we are shaped in a similar way, and we have to try and fight back against becoming Patrick Bateman, or becoming the pair of murderers of the Clutter family in Cold Blood.
Hmm. Wait, are you
Um,
trying to tell me Patrick Bateman isn't the cool hero of the story who I should aspire to?
he's a total Sigma Alpha, god of commerce. But yeah, no,
Uh,
I guess what I've always wanted to do in the stories that I've resonated with most, take you to the pit of despair and then lift you up. And that was, I think, the first time I really connected with, uh, you know, uh, a book when I was a kid. It was I think Huckleberry Finn was like that. I think the Star Wars movies are like that.
mhm.
Um, and uh, that to me is what I think storytelling is at its best, is that it can really take you there to the very bottom, the most degraded form of existence, and then show you the sort of the divine, for lack of a better word, where you can access something beyond yourself, and it makes you bigger, it makes your perspective larger. Um, and so I would also say another thing that I've consumed that makes me feel that way. I wish it was better, because like I'm a toxic fan in that way, but I feel like The Walking Dead attempts that in a very compelling way. Whether or not it succeeds
Hmm.
after the first two seasons, that's a 3 hour long conversation. But uh, that to me, that's what I would like to see more of. I would like to see stories that are an honest encounter with darkness that lift you to the light, I guess.
Yeah, maybe I feel like that's kind of what's lacking right now is, um, I guess, a while back I tried to watch Walking Dead. I couldn't get into it. Maybe I need to give it another chance. But that was early 2010s zombie fatigue more than anything, I think. Um,
Right.
but I guess that touches on one of the last things that I wanted to get to you with, because we had I feel like, at least to me, it was a really valuable interaction on Substack notes. I forget exactly what it was, like the specifics. Um, but it was about like the concept of marriage, or some of these institutions that have had negative aspects about them. Like, I don't think you or I need to go far to talk about like the ways that um, marriage or some of these more normative institutions can be oppressive or limiting for the human experience. Um, but at the same time, like at least for me, um, like specifically with the example of marriage, like my relationship to my wife is like probably one of the most important things to me in my life. And we are not technically government married. We will be at some point, but I think to choose to have these relationships, either familial or romantic, or um, even like to the broader society that you live in, and choosing, kind of like you said, to go acknowledge that the darkness exists, acknowledge that these institutions, because they have power and validity and give people meaning, can and are abused, but still choosing to believe in them anyway. I feel like that's kind of maybe the through line here, and kind of what I'm struggling with, like in my writing, my politics, my personal life. And I feel like maybe more broadly speaking, like people talk about the vibe shift as if it was, up, we're right wing, we were woke, and now we're anti woke right wing. I feel like it's this thermostatic thing that is shifting, because there's been, kind of like as you alluded to, maybe on a longer scale than that, but in like the post World War II, post 1950s, 60s world, just so incredibly materialistic and deconstructive. But like you can only deconstruct so much, where and people start to want to have something, as we were talking about, that's a little bit firmer ground to stand on, but also we're avoiding like the darker reactionary side of it. So I guess it's kind of a rambling way to ask you what your thoughts are, and like how can you thread that needle, because I really valued our dialogue on that, and that's something that I'm struggling with and trying to find like the good middle ground, because we can't be all totally atomized individuals. Even if that were materially possible still, I think it's spiritually destructive. But we can't also go back to like this idealized like this reactionary ideal of a idealized past that never really existed. So I guess, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think I'm looking at my bookshelf right now, and uh, I know it's a book that we've both read, and there's two books that are on my bookshelf, but one that made me read the other topic, which was I read Culture of Narcissism, and at one point Lash mentions Death of a Salesman, which I'd never read before, and I just so happened to have a copy, so I read that, and even at that time, we like to think that these issues that about the erosion of identity in the wake of work, or how, like you said, atomization, loneliness within the family unit, despite the fact that, you're trying to maintain this facade of we're perfect, everything's going great. Uh, it basically speaks to, like, I would say that I'm in the midst of the same dilemma. I think one of the ways I try and think about it is that, uh, context of our conversation about marriage, where I was coming from was the idea that you can be less of political disposition, that the live erodes community. And there's sort of the, like you said, like a desire by many to retreat into an imagined past. And there's a desire by many to say, like, hey, let's just trailblaze into the unknown and kind of start to formulate these new ideas of community that I think sometimes often hitch back into being appearances of the quote unquote old ways. So I think what I struggle with is that essentially the conundrum to me is this: is that are these ways that we have had for thousands of years to solve loneliness, to solve, creating stability, creating the environment for family and love, are these institutions that we've created, are they kind of capable of being reorganized into a way where it can be broadened successfully to include more people and draw to that? Or is the desire to take something old and try and bring it into the new age kind of keeping us in a static position? And so one example I might use is that, for example, a lot of people, like when we were growing up, there was this idea of broadening of marriage to include gay people. And now there's the idea that, there's a potential chance that could be thoroughly walked back. And that, I don't necessarily think that represents the will of the population of this country. Nevertheless, it stands to me an investigation of what is the nature of tradition? Is it a history that allows us to proceed into the future, or are there encumbering aspects to it that don't allow us to see the new paths that must be forged? But that's not to say that I'm engaged myself, and I'm assumed to be legally married and in the same way. But
Congrats.
I do kind of, yeah, thank you, appreciate that. And I do really struggle with that. I struggle with the weight of the past. And in one of my pieces, in the context of as we talked about Christianity earlier, I was at church and it was so beautiful, and I prayed and I had this great experience, which I've had repetitiously. But then I start to pay attention to other details, and there's sort of a marriage of nationalism with a certain kind of organized Christianity that does give me deep pause. And it makes me wonder if the kind of way that I might relate to a faith is even possible to believe under the weight of tradition. So I think me threading that needle is trying to understand, at what point, must you kind of trailblaze, and at what point must you kind of repair that which is behind you? And I think that's kind of something that in that conversation we touched on is a sort of generational struggle of what does a future where people feel less lonely, where they have the community they crave, where they feel like they can get what they need, what is the means of, is the, and obviously, and I'm sure it's not really, I haven't read this specific excerpt, but people like Karl Marx did view the kind of idea of the family as it is in the West as an institution that kind of held people back from a more egalitarian sharing of resources. I don't fully know if I would, shack up with that despite my left-leaning disposition, but I also don't know if I'm really even understanding the point that he's made. So,
yeah.
But I think the weight of time. What is the weight of history? Is it something we should shed? Is it something we should carry with us? That I do think about a lot as well.
Yeah, well, at least to me, to use those terms, it's a constant dialectic of figuring everything out. Because I remember one thing that struck me is you're talking about your experience in the church and praying, and also feeling, I don't want to say disgust necessarily, because I don't want to put words in your mouth, but a trepidation of some of the baggage that comes with it. But it makes me think of medieval Christianity, or even traditional Judaism or Islam, of the average they call it high church and low church. For the average person, this was something they didn't think about dogma and doctrine. They thought about the way that they related to the world and their understanding of how they interacted with their community and their spirituality. And to me, I hope, I feel, or at least I hope, that we're moving in the right direction with that, because in a line I sometimes use, to be a little bit inflammatory, and stay with me on this. Like there's nothing wrong with being gay, same-sex attraction, but the gay lifestyle is degenerate. And by that I mean, like, because gay people were marginalized from society and couldn't live in the same sort of social context that heterosexual people were able to, or like, you meet somebody, you date, etc. And then like you saw otherization of homosexual men who lived in these small communities where promiscuity and stuff like that was much more common. You saw much more higher rates of STDs. And to me, like, I feel like that action is not a good thing, and that's spread to heterosexuals now. And I feel like the rampant promiscuity is maybe good for some people, but like for most people, like I'm not saying you have to be a Puritan where you're you have your parents arrange your marriage, but the fact that has been uh delegated to apps now of like you can sleep with anybody within 15-20 minutes regardless of your gender or your sexuality now. Like, I feel like, at least to me, and if that makes me sound more conservative, fair enough, like we've maybe gone too far on that direction. So to me, like, the integration is to, like you said, make it more inclusive, make it so like, and if they're fringes, fair enough. But for the most part, I feel like most people want to, like, you date around and then you pair bond. Like, it doesn't have to be, like I said, puritanical arranged marriages. But at the same time, like, I want to find a way to synthesize what worked of the past, as far as like, um, like marriage or some of these traditions being cultural shorthand for somebody who is known and vetted in your community. And somebody, like, if you don't know, like, your cousin knows, your coworker knows, versus, where we've gotten to now where they're like some kind of dark and nebulous algorithm that determines who you get matched with, and a pay for play app that has a incentive to keep you lonely and unhappy, if that makes sense.
I think it does. I guess. I mean, I would say I think I don't think the queer community, to me, has a monopoly on the emptiness of promiscuous sex, because I think
Oh, and I tried to emphasize that, by the way. I don't want
no,
to make that sound
no,
like that, what I was saying. Like, everybody is like that now. That is the condition of modernity. So
right, exactly.
I didn't
But
mean
I
to
think
interrupt, but I
also
just didn't want to make that sound like that's what I was saying.
no, I get you. I get you. I think for me, what I think of it is that I've begun reading this book for a bit. I struggled to get through critical theory texts in timely fashion, but it's been very profound as far as I've read it so far. It's called The Promise of Happiness by Sarah Ahmed, and she basically, as far as I understand it to this point, is raising the point of, is our conception of happiness, as we are kind of discussing here, where it's like, oh, if you check the data says, you know, stable marital relationships are the means by which people can access happiness. And that if you look at, the data in, for example, Scandinavian countries and, other Western European states, the United States, the data is clear. Monogamy is the way to go. But she basically makes the argument that all of this is kind of a subtle kind of push towards, heteronormative monogamous relationships, and that it erases, different pluralized possibilities of happiness that maybe don't suit the status quo as, per this current moment in time. And I think, I think belonging and, the reduction of love to strictly sensation and the encouragement of that through market forces, like you said, that try to keep us more lonely and that fixate on a very approved transactional, strictly of the flesh kind of manner. I think that there's a lot of truth to that, and I think it's spreading, and compounds, like, obviously, like, I would consider myself a person on the left who very much struggles with, on the one hand, not wanting to put people who are already in a vulnerable position in a more vulnerable position by criminalizing sex work, but then on the other, understanding that the absolute power of market forces and how they dictate our lives mean that, in my opinion, no one can really adequately consent to being a kind of transactional sex worker in that manner, because it puts a sort of desperation and need, like a sort of something even where they say, oh, I'm opting in. Are you really opting in, or do you feel like you're between these tectonic plates of circumstance that force you to take this kind of lane?
Or are you an outlier who you can opt in? You have that level of privilege where for you it's a fun thing, and being, an edgy sex worker is cool, but for 99.9% of the people in sex work, that is not the case.
Exactly. And it's far more pervasive, than I think is truly said. But I do wonder, again, like, kind of getting back to Sarah Ahmed's analysis, is that I kind of proceed with, with like a little bit of trepidation into this issue, because of the fact that and I'm not saying at all that you're kind of just saying this on your end, but I just feel as if I struggle to concretely say, hey, like, the data says this, or in terms of receiving the maximum amount of happiness or life satisfaction or the right way forward. I don't want to, in considering the past, impose previous definitions onto people whom perhaps the placing of the gay community in this sort of criminal nomenclature for hundreds of years perhaps had an effect where it was a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, and that, by placing people on the outskirts of, quote unquote respectability, it drives them to a point where, if they at all try and, like, embrace the existence that they've had in that place, then it could be seen as, oh, this is an increase in the culture of degeneracy and such.
Yeah.
So I think it's an incredibly complicated thing, and I think, as far as I understand, there's a lot of disagreement, particularly among queer scholars, on the nature of, like, is a sort of like culture that where can acceptance of sex go too far, or is, in terms of, like, the actual act between people and things of that nature, or is like you said, is it puritanical to try and impose these sorts of kind of, as Sarah Ahmed would suggest, heteronormative status quo positions on people who are perhaps striving to do something beyond that which was past, I guess.
And that makes sense. I don't want to get too deep into the weeds on this, because I want to emphasize, like, I'm somebody who, like, my vision is essential, like, traditional but not conservative, in the sense that, like, I feel like, to me, it's very telling that, like, the impetus of, like, the gay rights movement was, despite what, like, some of the more super conservative people would say, was not like, let's destroy and tear down the family, was let's have gay marriage, because I think, monogamous pair bonding is almost universal in most developed societies. They wanted the franchise expanded, so, like, we're just like you, we just want to get married and have a family like anybody else. And to me, that's kind of what I come down to with it, as far as, like, synthesizing the good of the past while being, and not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, at the very least, while being flexible with the specificities of the current moment. Because to me, like, a family is a family, and it can look a lot of different ways. But I feel like that's like, the basis of a healthy society is community and family, and like having unalienated labor that makes sense within the context of your community.
I totally understand. I think what you're saying. A novel that I read that definitely would qualify as literature to me, that makes me think about this a lot, is Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. Kind of, it's a story about, I think, mostly taking place in Paris, if memory serves, where the main character, who is a gay man, obviously closeted due to the environment of the time, falls in love with another man. They kind of have this prolonged affair with each other, but then in a very heartbreaking turn, the other man kind of decides to return to his heterosexual life and pursue a marriage that is basically a fodder of what Western society would hold up as the exemplar of what you're supposed to do. And I guess, like you said, I want, there is a sense, I wonder about the imposition of, I mean, I don't know. I don't know what happiness in the future could look like, especially with how difficult, the certain, what feels to me to be a state of affairs onto which it's very hard to have recourse, and it's very hard to define your own desires, and it's very hard to, let alone impose them upon your circumstances. So to that end, I guess what I would always wonder is, if in my seeking of wanting people to pursue life that's more fulfilling, or what I would call more authentic, am I imposing the past in ways that I think one could think themselves a maverick, but still suffer from the societal conditions that formed you up until this point, whether you think that you are in lockstep with them or not. And I worry that, if I was to say, hey, like, do this or do that, or follow the traditional pathway sort of with these minor changes, would that truly lead to more happiness or fulfillment in the long run? I'm not sure. I think great novels have kind of really woken me up to that question. And I wonder about, as sort of this unfolding nature of the queer experience is revealed, and people try and get married, but still kind of like there's this hitch, again, there's this sort of counter revolution to the gay rights movement, I believe, taking place this moment, where does the legacy of that tradition and trying to redefine it, is there a factional presence that wants to be so intransigent that having an evolution of the idea is possible in that way? So I guess that's, to me, what I would kind of relate. And I think a book like Giovanni's Room explores those themes of concealment, attempted assimilation, versus if we're proceeding into something new, and the terror of that, especially with, a kind of large cultural pushback against it. It's something that I can think about a lot. But I don't have the answers. I would be a fool to claim as such.
And I think anybody who would do so is, in fact, a fool. But yeah, I think that's a really good point. Just because I think it's going to be a constant renegotiation, because I think there is this historical bias, or like, what do you call it, the recency bias, like, up until everything was traditional into the past, until like the last 50 years or so, whatever it was. But it's been a constant renegotiation between, I feel like, both the wisdom and folly of the past, as well as, like, the exciting new things, as well as like the things that are not working about modernity, the future, and new ideas. And that's going to be the constant, one of the few constants of humanity and like human experience. It's universal, because Because one of my favorite anecdotes about this ever is like, I remember reading this. It was like Socrates saying, like, we shouldn't have the written language because, if we start writing things down, nobody's going to talk anymore. It's like the Bronze Age version of like, oh, these kids are always on their damn phones. But so it's something that makes me feel like, I feel like we're probably going to be able to figure it out. It's going to be different, probably than you or I or anybody really thinks it's going to look like, but it's going to make sense to the people who are living it. At least that's what I'm hoping.
I think so too, and it's one of those things where I think when you try and redefine something that has where two people who need it to be static in a sense, in fact, because that intransigence is reassuring to them, and then you kind of try and bring this fluidity to it, arguably that still was always there, because even if you have the written canon of the Christian text, we're talking about a document that went through constant bouts of translation, and like you said, Socrates' point, like what was existed strictly as spoken word for, as far as I understood, at least 100 years before it was written down. So, and that I would comfortably say brings the fluidity to the conversation where there would be room to redefine and change. But to many people who are far more pious in their belief than someone like me, who's kind of like a Unitarian generalist, I guess, but would find that completely anathema to the very core of their belief system. And I think that is another element of, I guess in literature and learning about postmodernism in literature and learning about postmodernism in stories, I would argue that we've always lived in a sort of uncertain flow, an uncertain kind of liquidous dialectic, and that the concreteness has never really existed. But that doesn't mean that there's not precedent, the same way that there's legal precedent, and that each time, each iteration, you kind of have to build off of that which came before. But I kind of lost my train of thought in the sauce there, but that's kind of
that's I think that's a really good perspective, and that's a really good place to probably leave it, because we've been going about an hour and a half here. So, Peewee, I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I appreciate you coming on. We'll have to do something again sometime if you're interested. But do you, before we do our sign-off question, do you have any plugs or promotions, anything coming up, or like just generally want to promote your blog? What do you got going on?
I guess there's just some sci-fi stories that I am writing that I'm working pretty hard on. I'm thinking about dropping at least one of them on Substack as sort of kind of just, it's kind of novella length. I think in the end it'll be around like 20,000 words. But to our discussion earlier, I think it's my biggest attempt to try and accomplish my narrative goal, which is tell a story where things feel fresh and entertaining, kind of bring you to the pits and then raise you up. And it takes place in a kind of post-apocalyptic world inspired by, the Grapes of Wrath in many ways, and focusing on like a sort of deterioration of American movement as like a component of American life, but also what do you do when there's nothing to move to and you're moving for movement's sake, which I think actually Grapes of Wrath is kind of about as well. So I'm really excited about that. I think it's going to be, I don't know when it's going to come out, but I'm working hard on it, and just subscribe and you will see it soon enough. And I'd also like to say thank you so much for having me on the podcast. This is a really great conversation, and I'm down whenever, my brother.
Well, yeah, we'll figure something out. I appreciate everybody. If you're not already, subscribe to Peewee Hermeneutics. He has, like I said, he's a potpourri, or maybe a mixed cheese charcuterie of
There
various
we go.
types of literature. So Peewee, I always have like a final sign-off question, and I apologize if it's a little bit saccharine, but this has become my sign-off question. What is something that makes you feel hopeful for the future? Or, if you don't have anything in our, dark and gloomy times, what's something that would make you feel hopeful for the future?
I think it's something that I think it's something a couple of other really smart people on Substack, ironically enough, have noticed as well. I think that there's kind of an emerging dissident literacy movement, and I know it's something that was resonated with you as well, of trying to take back our attention spans from the sort of market forces that lead to quote unquote degeneracy, as some would call it. But I would, that I think where you're trying to return to a more intentional lane of thought, where you're trying to engage with different ideas, different perspectives, and trying to broaden how you see the world. I wish it was more widespread, but the fact that it exists at all gives me a lot of hope. I think if we all are reading more and reading well and trying to talk about difficult conversations, like about modernity and the future and the past, then, maybe the ticket to the actual promise of happiness is just in more intentional engagement, listening, reading, and learning, to be honest. As trite as it may sound, I think that this reemergence of critical engagement as like a antithesis to the shortening of attention spans gives me a lot of hope, and I hope to see more of it. And it's imperfect, but I think people are doing it.
Well, I'm with you right there. But Peewee, I really appreciate you coming on. This has been a fun time.
Absolutely. Thanks again, man. And subscribe to Prester John's Revenge if you want those awesome perspectives, that hidden cultural commentary, that weaving of pop culture, history, religion, and personal experience that you crave from Substack. Subscribe to Prester John today.
Ooh, I'm saving that for my bumper. All right, well, thanks, brother. This has been a fun time. You have a good one.
Absolutely. You too, man. Have a good day. Bye.